The photograph was 12 inches wide and smelled like old rain. That's what hit me before anything else did. Not the image inside it. Not what it showed. The smell. It was sitting in a manila envelope inside a cardboard box that had been mislabeled. Agricultural Survey Correspondence, 1902 to 1914, at a county historical archive in rural Ohio. Nobody had requested it in decades. The archivist told me the box had been flagged for digitization 3 separate times and skipped all 3. She didn't know why. She said that happens sometimes. I opened the envelope because I was looking for something else entirely. What I found inside was a photograph of a burial excavation, and in that excavation, arranged along the trench wall like sleeping soldiers, were human femur bones that came up past the knee of the man standing beside them. That man was not short. He was wearing a surveyor's coat and a wide-brimmed hat, and the bones reached his hip. Assuming average proportions, the individuals those bones belonged to would have stood somewhere between 7 and 8 feet tall. The photograph was dated September 4, 1907. By September 19, 1907, 15 days later, the county courthouse that housed the excavation permits, the land survey records, and the burial inventory for that site had burned to the ground in a fire officially recorded as accidental. The bones themselves were never catalogued by any state institution. The excavation team dissolved. And the town, a small farming community called Millhaven, population roughly 400, was absorbed into a neighboring township by 1912 and effectively ceased to exist on any official map. I've spent weeks trying to understand what happened in Millhaven in the autumn of 1907. What I found doesn't give me answers. It gives me something harder to ignore. It gives me a pattern. The official story, to the extent one exists, goes like this. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, amateur archaeology in rural America was largely unregulated and chaotic. Local farmers, land surveyors, and self-taught antiquarians dug up burial mounds, thousands of them, across the Ohio River Valley, the Mississippi Basin, and the Great Lakes region. This was the era before the Antiquities Act of 1906 had any meaningful enforcement mechanism, and before the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology had the resources to systematically document every reported site. In this environment, reports of giant skeletons were not uncommon. They appeared regularly in regional newspapers. The Worthington Advance, the Zanesville Courier, the Cincinnati Commercial, all published accounts between 1870 and 1915 describing excavations that allegedly produced skeletal remains of unusual size. Mainstream archaeology has a ready and reasonable explanation for this: measurement error, journalistic exaggeration, optical illusion created by the contrast between bone and surrounding soil, and the basic tendency of 19th-century newspapers to embellish stories that would sell copies. The Smithsonian, for its part, did collect and study thousands of skeletal remains from mound excavation sites during this period. Many of those remains are documented in the Bureau of Ethnology's annual reports, which are publicly available. Researchers like Cyrus Thomas produced meticulous, if now culturally complicated, analyses of mound builder populations. The scientific consensus, built over more than a century of anthropological study, is that the mound builders were ancestral Native American peoples, not a lost race, not an anomalous giant population, not something outside the understood scope of human prehistory. That is the official narrative. I want to be fair to it. It is well supported. It is reasonable. And it explains most of what was reported in that era. But it does not explain everything I found. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are where this gets uncomfortable. Between 1880 and 1920, newspaper accounts describing unusually large skeletal remains from burial mound excavations appeared in at least 47 different American states and territories. I'm not talking about fringe publications or occult newsletters. I'm talking about the New York Times, which ran a story on May 4, 1912 describing the discovery of 18 skeletons in Lake Delavan, Wisconsin, some allegedly reaching 8 feet in height. The story cited witnesses by name. It named the excavation leaders. It described the bones as being held by local institutions for further study. Those bones do not appear in any subsequent institutional record. That's not an oversight. That's a pattern. Speaking of Wisconsin, the Delavan excavation wasn't isolated. In 1891, archaeologist G. Henning documented burial mounds near Sheboygan County and reported skeletal material of remarkable size. His field notes, which I located through the State Historical Society of Wisconsin's manuscript collection, describe femur measurements that would place the individuals well above 6.5 feet. Henning's notes were submitted to the Bureau of Ethnology in Washington. They were received. They were logged. And then the institutional trail goes quiet. His findings don't appear in the published annual reports. His name doesn't appear in subsequent correspondence. His field notes are still there, sitting in a filing cabinet in Madison. But the follow-up is gone. Which brings me to the Smithsonian. The Bureau of Ethnology, which later became the Bureau of American Ethnology, collected an enormous volume of skeletal material during the mound excavation era. This is documented. It is not disputed. What is harder to document is what happened to specific portions of that collection. In 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, required federal institutions to inventory their holdings and return culturally affiliated remains to descendant communities. The Smithsonian's compliance process revealed something that researchers have been quietly noting ever since. The inventory contained significant gaps. Accession records reference remains that couldn't be located. Documentation chains broke at critical points. Thousands of items logged as received had no corresponding records of transfer, storage location, or disposition. The Smithsonian's official position is that these gaps reflect the organizational chaos of 19th-century institutional record-keeping. That is plausible. Record-keeping was chaotic. But here's what matters: the gaps are not random. When researchers like Richard Dewhurst, whose 2014 book on this subject, whatever you think of his conclusions, represents years of archival work, cross-referenced the Smithsonian's incomplete accession records against contemporary newspaper accounts of large skeleton discoveries, the overlap was striking. The sites most frequently mentioned in newspaper reports from the 1880 to 1920 period were disproportionately represented among the Smithsonian accession gaps. That's not proof of anything. But it is a pattern. And the pattern has a shape. Back to Millhaven. The excavation that produced the photograph I found in Ohio began in the spring of 1907. I know this from 3 surviving sources: a brief mention in the Ashland County Register dated April 18, 1907, describing remarkable earthworks uncovered during a drainage project, a letter in the private correspondence of one Harlan Fitch, a local land speculator, held at the Western Reserve Historical Society in Cleveland, and the photograph itself. Fitch's letter, written to his brother in Columbus on May 3, 1907, describes the site with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. He writes, and I'm paraphrasing here because the letter is under restricted access, that the mounds contained remains of persons of extraordinary physical proportion, and that a surveyor involved in the initial dig had contacted someone in Washington about the discovery. Fitch seemed worried about the land value implications. He mentioned that a government man had visited the site in July. No record of that visit exists in any federal archive I've been able to access. The courthouse fire happened on September 19th. The local fire marshal's report, which I found in the Ashland County Probate Court's supplementary records, misfiled under Miscellaneous Civil Proceedings, 1907 to 1909, listed the cause as probable electrical fault in the clerk's storage room. The investigation lasted 4 days. No further inquiry was conducted. The same report notes, almost as an aside, that survey and excavation documents pertaining to the drainage project on Millhaven Parcel 14C were among the materials destroyed. Parcel 14C was the excavation site. The timing is almost theatrical. I want to acknowledge something here, because intellectual honesty requires it. Courthouse fires were not rare in early 20th century America. County records across the country were lost to fire, flood, mold, and simple negligence throughout this period. The Millhaven courthouse fire could be exactly what the official record says it was: an electrical fault, a wooden building, a collection of irreplaceable documents turned to ash by mundane misfortune. That happens. It happened constantly. And reports of giant skeletons in 19th century newspapers are genuinely unreliable. Reporters embellished. Locals exaggerated. Optical illusions in excavation trenches are real. The bones of large but entirely typical Native American individuals were sometimes described in sensational terms by people who had no anthropological training and every incentive to make a good story better. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But here's where it gets harder to dismiss. In 2004, a team of physical anthropologists conducting a literature review of pre-Nagpur skeletal collections identified 17 sites, spanning Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Tennessee, where excavation reports from the 1880 to 1920 period described remains of exceptional size, and where institutional documentation of those remains became incomplete or vanished entirely within a decade of the initial discovery. Their paper, published in a mid-tier archaeology journal and largely ignored by mainstream outlets, didn't make any dramatic claims. It simply noted the evidentiary gap and called for further archival investigation. That paper has been cited exactly 3 times in the 20 years since its publication. 3 times. Speaking of evidentiary gaps, there's the question of the Vine Valley Mounds in New York. In 1880, a local physician named Dr. E. A. Allen documented a series of mounds near Yates County and reported skeletal material he estimated at 7 feet and over. His documentation was thorough. He was a methodical man, a doctor, trained in careful observation. He sent his findings to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian acknowledged receipt. In their 1881 annual report, the Vine Valley site is listed as under review. In 1882, it disappears from the record entirely. Allen himself, in a letter written to a colleague in 1884, expressed bewilderment at the institutional silence. He wrote, and this letter is held at the New York State Library in Albany, in the Manuscripts and Special Collections Division, available to researchers, that he had received no further correspondence despite repeated inquiries, and that he had come to believe the specimens had been misplaced or otherwise disposed of without explanation. Without explanation. The timeline isn't subtle. Let me tell you what I think is actually happening here, not as a claim, but as a hypothesis shaped by the pattern. American institutional archaeology in the late 19th and early 20th century was not simply disorganized. It was actively in the process of constructing a narrative. The mound builder controversy, the question of who built the thousands of earthworks that covered the American interior, was politically and racially charged in ways that are difficult to overstate. For much of the 19th century, the dominant theory among white American scholars was that the mound builders were a vanished, racially distinct civilization, possibly European in origin, that had been destroyed by the ancestors of contemporary Native Americans. This narrative served obvious ideological purposes in a period of aggressive westward expansion and forced removal. When the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology, under Director John Wesley Powell, undertook its systematic study of mound sites in the 1880s, one of its explicit goals was to debunk the lost race theory and establish Native American continuity with the mound builders. That conclusion, which modern archaeology fully supports, was scientifically correct. But the process of reaching it may have involved something more than just dispassionate scholarship. If remains existed that complicated the emerging consensus, remains that were anomalous in size, in morphology, in any way that opened the door to continued lost race speculation, there would have been institutional pressure to minimize, reinterpret, or simply make them unavailable for further study. Not necessarily through conspiracy. Not through some centralized order. But through the accumulated decisions of individual curators, archivists, and administrators who understood what the institution needed the evidence to say. That's not a conspiracy. That's how institutions work. Maybe the Millhaven bones were genuinely unremarkable, large individuals within the normal human range, and the fire was genuinely accidental, and the photograph I found was simply a moment of parochial drama that meant nothing in the larger scientific picture. Maybe the Smithsonian's accession gaps reflect nothing more than the chaos of 19th century bureaucracy. Maybe Dr. Allen simply stopped following up, and the institution's silence was administrative indifference rather than deliberate suppression. Maybe. But the pattern across 47 states, across 4 decades, across dozens of independent excavation reports that share the same trajectory: discovery, excitement, institutional contact, silence, missing records, that pattern does not feel like coincidence. It feels like weather. Like something systemic moving through the landscape of American archaeology, and leaving the same kind of mark everywhere it touched. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Here's what I keep returning to. In 1913, a retired Bureau of Ethnology field agent named Thomas Willoughby, his personnel file is in the National Archives, Record Group 106, available to researchers, wrote a private memorandum to a former colleague. The memorandum was never sent. It was found among his personal papers donated to the Smithsonian Archives after his death. In it, Willoughby described what he called the disposition policy, his term for remains that were, in his words, inconsistent with the working thesis. He was not specific about what that policy entailed. He did not use the word destruction. But he wrote that certain materials had been handled administratively, rather than scientifically, and that he had concerns about the long-term integrity of the institutional record. That memorandum exists. It is sitting, buried in plain sight, in the Smithsonian Institution Archives, Accession 17-013, Box 4. Nobody sent it. But it was written. And Willoughby wrote it because something was bothering him. Something he had seen that he couldn't entirely make peace with. The part that keeps me up at night isn't the bones themselves. It's that. A man who spent his career in service of a scientific institution, sitting alone at the end of his life, writing a letter he never sent, about materials that were handled in ways that troubled him enough to put pen to paper. What did he see? The photograph from Millhaven is still in that manila envelope in Ohio. I made a copy. The archivist made a note of it in the catalog system, the first notation that box had received in 11 years. She asked me what I was looking for, and I told her I wasn't entirely sure yet. That's true. I don't have answers. I have a photograph that smells like old rain. I have a courthouse fire 15 days after an excavation report. I have a field agent's unsent letter and a researcher's citation count of 3. I have 47 states and 4 decades and a pattern that looks the same everywhere I look. The bones from Millhaven, whatever they were, whoever they belonged to, are gone. The records are ash. The town isn't on modern maps. And the man standing next to those femur bones in the photograph is looking directly at the camera with an expression that I cannot quite read, even after staring at it for weeks. He looks like a man who knows something has been found that will not be allowed to stay found. Maybe I'm wrong about all of this. Maybe I'm connecting threads that don't belong together, building architecture out of coincidence and archival neglect. But I keep thinking about Willoughby in his study, writing a letter to no one. And I keep thinking about the archivist who told me that box had been flagged for digitization 3 times and skipped all 3. She didn't know why. I don't know why either. And that, maybe, is the most honest place I can leave you.